my husband and I were married for quite a few years. We were very involved in a church in New York, and we were actually involved a little bit in church planting. And I never felt that biological clock ticking. I didn't think about it. It wasn't that I didn't want children. We were just so busy working full time, getting the church established, and then amazingly, I got pregnant at the same time as my sister, and my sister lives in New York, and we were so excited. We'd always talked about that, but never planned it. And it was just, I felt, wow, I'm pregnant at the same time. We're so excited, da da da. And then sadly, I had a miscarriage, and it was tough. It was difficult. There were some complications, and we were unable to have children of our own after that. So my sister had her son, and he was wonderful. I was very involved with him, and I was praying, and I felt like, God, if you want me to be a mom, could you make it clear? And at that point, we had talked about adoption on and off over many years. And it was a Sunday. I remember Sunday morning, we were in our church in New York City, and in our bulletin there was an ad for foster parents for newborns. It was a new ministry that Hope for New York was helping in New York, and I thought, wow, kind of my heart stopped, and I thought, maybe this is what God wants me to do, because if we foster a newborn and it's a great experience, maybe then we move forward into adoption, because I really wanted to know, is this from God? So it actually wasn't until about a year later that we received a call asking if we could foster a baby boy. And at the time, the news caught me completely off guard, because I'd taken a new assignment at work. My life was kind of planned out. And I just thought, wow, I don't know. But as I prayed, I realized that no time is the right time. And so I agreed to take the baby for a month. They had told me, the agency said, that they don't like you to have the baby longer than a month because you might bond. And also, it usually takes less than that time for the paperwork to be done. I mean, what you're fostering for is so that all the official stuff can be done for the potential adoptive parents. So when I was driving to the hospital, I remember thinking, I wonder what the baby's name is. Because if I had a baby boy, I'd name him Philip. So I get to the hospital, I meet the social worker for the first time, and the first thing she says is, the baby doesn't have a name. Would you have a name for him? I'm like, would I have a name? And I said, sure, I said, Philip. And she calls the director of the agency, who said, that's my husband's middle name. What a great name. Okay, so, I was thrilled. And I also had the privilege of meeting his birth mom at the hospital. It was a young woman who had made the difficult and painful choice to give up her baby boy. I can't imagine, but she loved him enough, first of all, to give birth.
Yes.
And then to want a good home for him, a home that she could give. So Philip was 5 days old when we brought him home. And, to take care of a newborn, so totally dependent on us for food, nourishment, love, and support. It was an awesome responsibility, but a reminder of how God takes care of us when we entrust our lives to him. So anyway, every day I would tell Philip, you're going to go to a great home, you're going to be loved even more, this kind of thing. And it was about 3 weeks later, and I was holding Philip, and I looked into his eyes, and he looked back at me so intently, with a smile on his face, and I felt this tug at my heart, and tears filled my eyes, and I said to myself, oh, get a grip, Al. Because, I back then I was not one to cry easily, okay? It takes being a mom to be a sobber. I was actually listening to the radio at the time too, and one of my favorite Christian speakers said, life is like a coin. You can spend it any way you want, but you only get to spend it once. Mm-hmm. And I had been asking God, What do you want me to do with my life? And I felt that he was saying, Philip, is your ministry. Well, in my mind, I'm thinking that's nice, but the agency had already told me that usually you can't foster to adopt. It doesn't usually happen. And so I thought, but I think I really want to be a mom, So I picked up the phone. I left a message for the director because she wasn't there. And I just said, what would we need to do to move forward into adoption? Anyway, that afternoon, she calls me and she said, Alison, today, Philip's birth mother signed the surrender papers. And until she did that, we couldn't notify our 70 other officers that he was available. And also, she said, the couple we had in mind haven't passed their medical, so they don't even know about him. And the social worker had been at the hospital and had actually said to the birth mother, how would you feel if the Duncans were to adopt Philip? And she said, well, that would be lovely. Then the director said, so we'd be delighted to give you and your husband first dibs at adopting Philip.
How wonderful.
It was one of those rare times when I was speechless. I was like, and I remember saying, I need to call my husband. And she said, of course, yes. So I called him. And at the time he was an administrator at the hospital. He had an office. He was never in it. He had a pager. He never answered it. But I called him in his office anyway because I was so nervous. And he picked up. Okay, that was such a God moment. And then I explained everything to him and I said, are you ready for this? And without hesitation, he said, yes. I like to tell people that's one of the first and only times that we ever were in total agreement in like 2 seconds, So, Philip actually is now 18. He's in college and we cannot imagine life without him. We still thank God daily for his amazing provision, love, and grace in giving us our son. For the adoption agency, being in our bulletin, for Philip's birth mother, who had other options, but she chose to give life to this dear little boy. And, it just showed me that, when we least expect it, God is there to show us that he has a plan for our lives, which is so much more richer and fulfilling than we could ever know. I'd always told Philip that God, just as God adopts us into his family as his sons and daughters when we accept Jesus Christ, so we adopted Philip into our family as our son. He's always known that he's adopted, but he's always known that he's special, and he's always known that he's our son. So we're thankful. I love the fact that we could adopt. I think it's a great thing.
What would you say to someone who is looking at adoption right now?
I think that, for me, it was, in a way, you could say the only option. But, I got pregnant once and I lost the baby. And many well-meaning people would say, well, why don't you try and other methods in vitro? And today there are several other kinds of methods as well. And my response was always, I got pregnant once, so God can make it happen again. And if it doesn't happen, then he has another plan. And his plan was adoption. I don't think that I could love Philip any more than if I had given birth. So yeah, I am totally for adoption. I'm thankful I got a baby.
Yeah.
And that was the desire of my heart. I really, I wanted a baby, but I take my hat off to those who adopt older children. I think it's a calling. I really do. It's definitely a calling.
Yes. So, how can someone get involved adopting, say, maybe in their local area? Do you think that they could go through their church or their places that they could go? Or
yes, I think there are a lot of churches really have ministries for adoptive parents, because I know when Philip was little, it seemed like he thought everybody was adopted because we met so many people who had adopted, not just, we adopted Philip in New York City, but they adopted overseas. And so there was obviously a need. When we were with the agency, every year they would have an adoption picnic. And so we would meet all these other families that adopted from all over New Jersey, because we had moved out to North New Jersey by then. And it was great because you share experiences, and you also learn about different agencies. You learn about the churches that have a ministry. In our case, it was in the bulletin in our New York church. I definitely feel that, and if you Google it, oh my goodness, there are so many. And I can't emphasize enough too, just praying. Because, God led us. We weren't actively looking at that point. And when I saw that ad, it wasn't, oh, yes, we're going to adopt. It was, let's foster first and see.
Right.
And my thinking at the time was, it's so fun. We get to take the baby, we get to have fun, and then we get to hand him over. Someone else gets to raise him and go through the teenage years, and
Yeah.
And meanwhile God's thinking, aha.
Well, this is so encouraging to someone that's out there that's really like looking at adoption right now, and maybe fostering a child. There's so many children that need a home, so many children. And I know there's somebody that's going to take a step out and who has been considering it. And is there something that you could say to them that would help them to know that God is with them and He's working?
When you know that God is in it, there is a certain peace. We have friends who adopted through the New Jersey, what do you call it? Like, it's a foster system. And, there have been challenges, but it's amazing how God works things out when we rely on Him. In our case, I had said that we signed up to foster and we didn't get the call till a year later. But actually, in that time, we received 2 phone calls, but I was away. Since I'm from New Zealand, I made a trip every other year or every 2 years if I could. And so I wasn't around to take the baby. When we got the call to take Philip, it was actually Labor Day weekend. And there was a list because, we weren't the only ones signed up. But no one had been available because everyone had been away. And my husband told me, call and at least let them know we got the call. So I did, and that's when the social worker said, actually, the baby's still in the nursery at the hospital. And I was like, oh, The third thing was, the birth mother was not a client of the adoption agency. She had the baby, and she stopped one of the nurses and said, how do I put my son up for adoption? And that staff nurse was a sister-in-law of the director of our agency. All the paperwork that we had filled out, apparently the social worker had us fill out far more than we needed to, and included adoption. So the paperwork for us was already done. I had been told that it's not usual to foster, to adopt, and yet God made it clear. It's amazing, right? The fact that even when we moved into adoption, the ease of the paperwork, I was a little concerned, getting in the lawyer. The adoption agency provided names for 3. We picked one. They turned out to be amazing. It was so effortless in many ways. It was streamlined. We were told that we'd have to wait several months because they had to do due diligence on finding the birth father. And I had friends that would say, are you worried? Are you concerned? You might lose him. And I was able to tell them, no, I have total peace. Because if God wants us to be Philip's parents, we're going to be Philip's parents. And I didn't lose a night of sleep all those months. I had just peace. And inside I had this assurance, I felt like, he's my son. But, you don't say that because it sounds so boastful and so arrogant, really, I guess. But I just felt God saying it's okay. And when we the adoption was finalized, we had to go to the Bronx Family Court. And going to court anyway is nerve-wracking. But again, the process was amazing. We met the partner. They had to send a partner from the law firm for the first time. He was the nicest guy. We go up into this huge room, and there's tons of kids running around. They're all dressed up, so cute. They're all going to be adopted. It was such a wonderful atmosphere. It's this joy. You could feel it because, the adoptions were going to be made official. And I'm thinking, okay, so what I think is, oh, we're going to be here all day. There's so many. And then our lawyer said, Judge Philip Siegel, I know him. And he disappears off into a side room. Then he comes back and he sits down and he just smiles and he goes, everything's going to be fine. And then the clerk comes out and he calls us first. And we're like, whoa. So we walk in and all these other families are like, And we were asked a bunch of questions and everything. And then the judge said, congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Duncan, on the official adoption of your son, Philip. And I said, oh, can we take a photo? And the judge said, yes. We were sitting at a table. He goes, let's go up. It was like a slight platform. Let's go up behind my desk so we can have the words, in God we trust, in your photo. I just felt that was God's final seal of approval. It's done. So when you see God work like that, I mean, he couldn't have hit us harder with a 2x4, right?
Well, Alison, thank you so much for coming on to this program and sharing your experience with everyone, because we know that God has a plan for each and every person who has a love for a child in their heart and wants to give them a home. So I thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thanks.